Hello, everyone. So I'm really glad, and I thank Mr. Durand for welcoming us today, and also, of course, Monsieur Fabius and Monsieur Aguila, who presented us this pact. We are now in a section, a roundtable, about how does civil society and the different parties get involved into the discussion about environmental law at the international level. And I would like, first of all, to give the floor to Mrs. Patrizia Heidegger from the European Environmental Bureau. And I will present you maybe each one at a time so that we can have some speeches. What we want with this session is to have also a discussion with you. So the participants will be quite short in their presentations. But the first questions I wanted to ask them, each one of them, is how do you feel environment today needs this pact? And how do you feel also that this pact can help you in your activities, both with civil society and NGOs, but also with the companies or with the Union of Workers? And maybe also what is lacking today in international law, but maybe also how can we go further than the actual proposal of the pact that we've been able to discuss just a bit before. So, Patrizia, you're the Director for Global Policies and Sustainability in the Environmental Bureau, and you've been working on this full set of environmental international law, more than 3,000 treaties today. Maybe you can give us a bit your idea or your point of view about the environment and the world, of course, but also what is lacking today and how we can move forward.
Thank you very much. I represent the European Environmental Bureau. We are the largest association of environmental organizations in the EU. We represent 150 environmental organizations, including large networks, and we represent around 30 million European citizens who are engaged in the environmental movement. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting us and for including us in this debate. And one of the main points I would like to make today is that it's really crucial to include civil society very actively in this process. I think that for the time being, there's a bit of a gap. I think a lot of environmental organizations still struggle how to relate to this Global Pact for the Environment discussion. They're wondering how they can get engaged. So I'm not saying it's also our obligation, of course, to get engaged. But I think it's crucial to create meaningful ways of participation for civil society, also because through civil society we can mobilize people, we can create some more momentum around the discussion. But I'll come back to that point. So I don't think I can tell anyone in this room anything new when I say that we all know that we are in a state of environmental emergency. And that we need new and bold instruments to address this situation. A little bit more than a year ago, there was a warning letter signed by 15,000 scientists from around the world telling us that humankind is in full collision course with the natural world. I think we're all aware of some of the biggest environmental problems that we're facing globally, but also in the EU. Even though we like to see ourselves as leaders of sustainability. Just to mention 3-4 examples, air pollution, 90% of European citizens live in places where we breathe in air that is toxic or beyond the thresholds that affect our health. By 2050, the oceans will contain more plastic than fish if we don't change drastically the way we deal with plastic waste. We are all aware, and we have seen it ourselves, the weather extremes, the drought, the floods that climate change is already bringing, which is affecting farming, livelihoods around the world, which will trigger massive waves of migration in the next decades. And last but not least, we're really regressing when we look at biodiversity. We are facing the sixth mass extinction, the only mass extinction created by humankind. With severe consequences for ourselves. So the picture is pretty bleak. But there's also a good thing happening at the moment. I feel that a lot of people are understanding that emergency state we're in. We see the young people taking to the streets, not only in Brussels. We see 35,000 young people demonstrating here. At the same time, 35,000 demonstrating in Berlin for sustainable food systems. So I think there's a new momentum, and this Global Pact for the Environment is can be another key driver that we all want to use. So I think it's obvious to state that the environmental organizations are supportive of this project. However, I think that there might be some other additional ideas that the civil society organizations can bring to the table. So I don't want to say too much about what is lacking in international environmental law now, because the first panel has already covered that quite well. And I think the advantage of the discussion on the Global Pact for the Environment is that we're having this discussion. I mean, what are the existing gaps? And that this discussion has come back to the table. And we've seen quite a controversial discussion in Nairobi 2 weeks ago about what are the gaps and how can they be filled, but at least we force the governments from around the world to talk about them and to come to a conclusion. The fact that a human right to a healthy environment does not yet exist as a codified human right is definitely one of the biggest gaps, and I think it's quite obvious to all of us that this gap needs to be filled, even though, unfortunately, not all governments of the world agree that this human right to a healthy environment exists. We've already heard about the procedural rights, the rights that are covered by the Aarhus Convention for us here in Europe. That's another big gap, of course, that the Global Pact for the Environment could fill. But I would like to focus on a more systemic gap that I see in international environmental law, which is the missing link, or a very weak link, between the environmental, social and economic dimension of sustainable development, which so far in multilateral environmental agreements is often missing, or it's quite weak. So the big question is, how can we really make sure that the concept of sustainable development gets translated into legally binding environmental law? And to go a step further, the current system of international environmental law is not necessarily based on an understanding what the scientists call the Earth system. So the fact that our planet functions through complex systems of physical, chemical, biological processes, and that there are certain limits, usually phrased as planetary boundaries, that we should not trespass in order to stay in a safe operating space. So how can international environmental law address this and recognize these planetary boundaries and come up with instruments that force governments to recognize these boundaries and stay within them? So I think this is one big question that we need to discuss together in that process of the Global Pact for the Environment, and see how we can develop a more systematic approach to environmental governments, global environmental governance, to consider these planetary boundaries. Now, looking at the draft pact as it's written now, and how could what is in the pact already help us, and what is maybe missing. So I think a very first advantage of the pact as it stands now is pretty simple. It just underscores the importance of actually having legally binding international environmental law. That's a very important statement these days, unfortunately. Well, we have mentioned the right to a healthy environment, which is of symbolic value, but we have just heard from the judges before, it goes way beyond symbolic value. The same is true for the duty to protect the environment and all the principles that have been mentioned on the first panel. So it's obvious that all these principles would help us and would help especially enforcement at national level to better enforce international environmental law. So there are a lot of advantages, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because they have been well covered. Let me just raise a couple of elements where I think that they're either missing or where we should together discuss how they can be strengthened in the draft as it stands now. So one is regarding a substantive right, a right for environmental defenders and media to have the right to pursue that work in a safe way. I think we have seen quite a good developments at international level to protect the rights of environmental defenders, but I think the Global Pact would be a place where the rights of environmental defenders should be further strengthened. You're all aware of the fact that every single year is a new peak of how many environmental defenders are not only threatened but killed for their work. So I think this is one substantive right that we have to elaborate on in the Pact. The next one I've already mentioned, the question of how to make that connection between the different dimensions of sustainable development, and the Pact as it stands now, the draft, mentions the principle of integration of sustainable development objectives in government policies. I think we have to go further than just integration into government policies. I think we have to have the objective that all policies have to have sustainable development as their objective, which is, goes beyond integration. And as I've said before, we need to discuss how we can recognize the Earth system and its tipping points, the planetary boundaries, through legally binding obligations. How can we put these elements of the interconnectivity, the interlinkages of the different environmental problems that are so scattered at the moment between the different MEAs, how can we make that element stronger in the Pact? How can we make sure that the Pact will help us to find solutions how to share the finite sources that we have on the planet? How can we ensure climate justice, environmental justice? How can we deal with debt, historic debt, ecological debt? These are questions that still have to be addressed. Two more elements. One is linked to the duty to care for the environment. You're all aware of ongoing discussions in Geneva concerning a binding treaty on business and human rights, which as an objective has to install an obligation or a due diligence obligation on business, including for negative social and environmental impact in value chains. So I think in the Global Pact for the Environment, we also have to clarify the role for non-state actors, in particular the role of business, and what does a duty to care for the environment mean, not only for governments, but also for non-state actors, in particular companies, and create that link to the discussion that we're having on the Treaty on Business and Human Rights. And the last point is that what we also need to add are both economic and financial measures. I don't think that the Global Pact, or I think that the Global Pact could bring much more change if we also include elements on what has to change in the economic system that we follow at the moment, what has to be different, what financial instruments are necessary to reach the objective of using resources in a sustainable way. All these elements are at the moment not really covered in international environmental law, but they have to be covered in order to meet the objective that we all want to meet together. So I think I'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It was quite full. It's true that we're here talking about a third generation of rights, a third generation of international pact, but we're also talking about binding treaties for businesses and also about a third generation of commercial agreements. So I'm quite happy because the person we have just after in the panel is Nicolas Beaumont,